High above the California coast, where the fog rolls in like a living tide and the mountains fall away into the sea, stands a palace that should not exist, a place born from memory, obsession, and a dream too immense for its own foundation. Today we call it Hearst Castle, but long before the tours, the postcards, and the museum ropes, it was simply the impossible vision of one man, William Randolph Hearst, a man who shaped headlines and tried to shape a kingdom. A man who outran rivals, rewrote journalism, and built an empire of influence, only to pour his fortune into stone towers rising above the clouds. A man who dreamed in the language of Europe's grand halls and ancient palaces, and found the one architect capable of turning that dream into reality. But behind the shimmering pools and glittering mosaics lies a story rarely told. A story of relentless ambition, fragile love, financial collapse, and a retreat that became both sanctuary and symbol. A story of the woman who filled the castle with life, and the architect whose brilliance made it possible. This is the rise, the ruin, and the legacy of America's most extravagant private estate. This is the true story of Hearst Castle. If you're captivated by the hidden stories behind America's grandest places, its mansions, monuments, and the powerful figures who shaped them, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us continue uncovering the untold histories that shaped this country's rise and its shadows. And if you want more deep dive episodes like this one, let us know in the comments. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. The morning light settled softly over San Simeon, casting long, pale streaks across the terraces of Casa Grande. The great house, with its twin towers and carved stone facade, stood quiet, far quieter than it had been during its golden years. Inside, footsteps echoed faintly along the tiled floors as William Randolph Hearst walked through the rooms he had spent nearly 3 decades shaping. At 79, his once commanding stride had slowed, though the familiar surroundings still seemed to draw a spark of determination from him. He paused beneath the vaulted ceilings, lingering in each space as if photographing it in his mind. For years, this hilltop had been his sanctuary, a place where he gathered statesmen, actors, writers, and friends. A place built not from necessity, but from memory, ambition, and an almost childlike sense of wonder. Now, in 1947, the estate felt heavier, almost watchful, as Hearst moved from room to room for what would become the final time. Outside his chambers, his physician waited with a file tucked under one arm, exchanging a quiet, concerned glance with the advisors who stood nearby. They had been urging Hearst for weeks to consider leaving San Simeon. His health had been deteriorating steadily, and the remote location made constant medical care increasingly difficult. Beverly Hills, they insisted, offered better access to doctors, equipment, and immediate attention should anything worsen. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a necessity. But Hearst resisted. He had built a world here, stone by stone, idea by idea, and step by stubborn step. Leaving felt like severing himself from the most personal expression of his life. As he reached the terrace, he steadied himself against the balustrade and looked out over the rolling hills that stretched toward the Pacific. The view had not changed since he was a boy camping on this land with his pa's rents. For decades, it had been the vista that greeted him each morning and the last thing he saw at sunset. A breeze lifted across the hilltop, stirring the cypress trees and carrying with it the distant sound of the ocean. Hearst's eyes followed the horizon as if searching for a reason to stay, something his doctors could not override, something time itself might allow him to reclaim. But the truth lingered at the edges of his thoughts. The estate was becoming too much for him to manage, and his body, though unwilling to admit it, was reaching its limits. His advisors approached gently. The car was ready. The arrangements were made. Hearst took one final look at the castle, the terraces, the towers, the sculptures imported from Europe, the pools he had redesigned again and again. It was not just a home. It was a reflection of nearly every part of his identity, his imagination, his ambition, his contradictions, his longing for permanence. With a small nod, he allowed himself to be escorted toward the waiting vehicle. It would take him down the winding road to the highway, and from there to Beverly Hills, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. Behind him, the castle remained on its hill, unfinished but majestic. a monument to a dream too vast to ever be fully completed. As the car pulled away and the towers of Casa Grande slipped out of view, one truth settled quietly over the moment. William Randolph Hearst would never return to San Simeon. To understand why leaving hurt so deeply, we must go back to where his dream began. Long before William Randolph Hearst shaped newspapers or built castles, he was simply a curious boy from California whose eyes were open to a world far larger than anything he had ever imagined. In 1873, when he was 10 years old, his parents, George Hearst, a rising mining magnate, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, an educated and culturally curious woman, took him on a grand tour of Europe. What began as a family trip would become one of the most formative experiences of his life. For months, the young boy traveled through countries whose histories stretched back centuries before the United States even existed. He wandered through vast stone castles perched on cliffs, marveling at grand halls lit by stained glass windows. He climbed worn staircases in medieval fortresses, traced the edges of intricate carvings, and stood silent beneath cathedral ceilings that soared high above him like gateways to another world. Each place carried a sense of time and craftsmanship that overwhelmed him. While George observed mining operations and business opportunities, Phoebe guided William through art galleries and museums. She encouraged him to look closely at paintings, to examine ancient artifacts, and to ask questions about the builders who shaped these monumental spaces. Under her influence, William began to understand that architecture could be both a reflection of its era and a statement of personal vision. Everywhere he went, he collected things. Small souvenirs, postcards, inexpensive trinkets, anything that reminded him of the grandeur he saw. His early fascination with collecting was more than a child's hobby. It was a way to capture the feeling these places gave him. Phoebe nurtured this interest, never dismissing it, and even helping him choose pieces that were meaningful, rather than merely decorative. She introduced him to the idea that objects carried stories, and that one could build an entire world by surrounding oneself with the right pieces. In London, he stood before the Tower of London, imagining the lives that had passed through its gates. In Paris, he explored the Louvre, overwhelmed by corridors lined with masterpieces. In Spain and Italy, he encountered buildings whose mosaics, columns, and courtyards whispered tales of ancient civilizations. These places were not simply buildings, they were experiences, each shaped by someone's dreams, wealth, obsessions, and ambitions. As the months passed, a quiet seed began to take root in his imagination. He didn't yet know what form it would take or when it might emerge, but something inside him had shifted. He felt a connection to the vastness of history and beauty that surrounded him, an understanding that a home, an estate, or even a simple room could express something profound about the person who created it. By the time the tour ended, he returned to America with a suitcase filled with souvenirs and a mind filled with possibilities. He would never forget the castles that towered over him, the galleries that dazzled him, or the artistry that seemed woven into every stone. Though he was still a boy, the impressions left by Europe would follow him for the rest of his life. And in the years to come, that memory, the awe of a boy standing beneath ancient walls, would grow into something far grander than anyone could have expected. When William Randolph Hearst entered Harvard in the early 1880s, he was a young man with charm, ambition, and a mischievous streak. Though he enjoyed campus life, his interests drifted far from academic discipline. He poured his energy into the Harvard Lampoon, where he honed his skill for satire and editorial flair, skills that would later help shape American journalism. But his penchant for pranks and a disregard for rules eventually caught up with him. Hearst was expelled not once, but twice, closing the door on a traditional academic path and pushing him toward a different future. That future arrived in 1887 when his father, George Hearst, by then a wealthy mining entrepreneur and U.S. Senator, handed William control of the San Francisco Examiner. The newspaper had been financially troubled, more burden than asset, but William saw possibility where others saw failure. He took the helm with the confidence of someone who had found his calling. Hearst immediately transformed the Examiner. He introduced bold, sensational headlines designed to seize attention at first glance. He invested in detailed illustrations, hired talented writers, and encouraged aggressive investigative reporting. Under his leadership, the paper exposed corruption, championed public causes, and entertained readers with a mix of drama and spectacle. Circulation climbed quickly. The Examiner, once an ailing publication, became one of the most influential papers on the West Coast. Seeking a broader stage, Hearst set his sights on New York City, the heart of American publishing. In 1895, he purchased the New York Journal and ignited a fierce rivalry with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. The competition between the two titans ushered in the era of yellow journalism, marked by sensationalized stories, dramatic headlines, and emotionally charged reporting. Hearst's papers pushed boundaries using bold visuals, daring exposés, and occasionally exaggerated narratives to captivate the public. During the tense months leading to the Spanish-American War in 1898, Hearst's newspapers played a powerful role in shaping public sentiment. Their coverage of events in Cuba, particularly the sinking of the USS Maine, stirred national fervor and influenced the climate in which the United States entered the conflict. Though historians continue to debate the extent of his paper's impact on government decisions, there is no question that Hearst's voice in print had become impossible to ignore. By the early 20th century, William Randolph Hearst stood at the head of one of the largest media empires in the world. His holdings expanded to include dozens of newspapers across major cities, as well as magazines, news services, and later, ventures into film and radio. He was not simply a newspaper owner. He was a force capable of shaping public opinion, setting trends, and challenging powerful institutions. His wealth grew alongside his influence, giving him the means to pursue ambitions that reached far beyond journalism. The boy who once wandered through European palaces had become a titan, surrounded by resources vast enough to bring even his grandest dreams within reach. And soon, on a quiet hilltop on California's Central Coast, he would begin turning those dreams into stone. When Marion Davies first crossed paths with William Randolph Hearst in 1917, she was a promising young actress just beginning her journey in the film industry. Hearst, already a towering figure in American media, encountered her on a film set and was immediately captivated, not merely by her beauty, but by her warmth, wit, and natural charm. Their meeting marked the beginning of a partnership that would define the rest of his life, both publicly and privately. Davies was more than a rising starlet. She was someone Hearst felt drawn to in a way that surprised even him. She offered a kind of lightness and happiness that contrasted sharply with the relentless demands of his media empire. As their relationship deepened, she became a central emotional anchor in his world. Yet their bond unfolded beneath the shadow of a complicated reality. Hearst remained legally married to Millicent Hearst, though their marriage had long been strained. Because divorce was socially and politically risky for someone of Hearst's stature at the time, he and Davies built a life together that was widely understood but never officially recognized. Despite this, their relationship endured with remarkable loyalty. Davies stood by Hearst for more than 30 years, navigating the delicate balance between public scrutiny and private devotion. Hearst, in turn, supported her ambitions wholeheartedly. Using the resources of his publishing empire, he promoted her film career, financing productions and ensuring she received attention in his magazines and newspapers. While some critics claimed her success was manufactured, Davies's comedic talent and screen presence earned genuine admiration from many in the film community. As the years went on, Davies became more than Hearst's companion. She became a hostess, confidant, and the social heart of many gatherings. Nowhere was this more evident than at San Sime. When Hearst began inviting guests to the growing estate, Davies ensured that they felt welcome. She organized events, mingled effortlessly with visitors, and infused the castle's grand halls with a sense of fun and warmth. Her presence softened the imposing scale of the estate, turning it from a monument of ambition into a place where people truly enjoyed themselves. For Hearst, Davies represented joy at a time when his responsibilities and ambitions weighed heavily on him. She offered laughter when pressures mounted, companionship during long stretches away from the public eye, and unwavering support when critics challenged him. Their partnership grounded him emotionally in a way few things could. As their life together took shape, Hearst began imagining a world in which he could share more than just moments with Marion. He wanted to build a space that reflected the richness of the life he envisioned with her. By this time, his media empire had grown vast, and the boy, dazzled by European architecture, now had both the fortune and determination to recreate that splendor on his own terms. The stage was set for him to transform his memories and ambitions into something tangible, a place where he and Marion could gather friends, entertain luminaries, and create a world entirely of their own making. San Simeon was waiting. Long before the towers of Casa Grande rose above the mist, before the Neptune pool shimmered with marble grandeur, San Simeon was simply a rugged hilltop where a young William Randolph Hearst camped with his family. The land, stretching across the coastal mountains and overlooking the Pacific, was part of the vast ranch that his parents cherished. In those early years, when tents and campfires replaced the stone walls and ornate ceilings that would someday stand there, Hearst discovered a place that stirred something deep inside him. As a boy, he explored the slopes on horseback, watching the fog roll in from the ocean and settle below the hill as if the world were divided into two realms, one above the clouds and one far below. At night, lying beneath blankets of stars, he listened to the wind sweeping over the ridges. These moments left an imprint on him, a sense of wonder and belonging that would follow him into adulthood. The hilltop became not just a place on a map, but a memory tied to adventure, family, and the feeling of being suspended between earth and sky. In 1919, when Phoebe Apperson Hearst, William's beloved mother and a major influence in his cultural life, passed away, he inherited an astonishing 250,000 acres of ranch land, including the hilltop at San Simeon. Her death marked a profound shift in his personal world, but it also unlocked the possibility of returning to the place that had shaped so many of his childhood experiences. With the ranch fully under his control, Hearst began thinking about how he might reclaim that hilltop, not as the boy who once camped there, but as the man he had become. At first, his vision was modest. He told architect Julia Morgan that he wanted to build a little something on the site, a simple bungalow where he could escape from the pressures of his expanding media empire. A retreat, nothing more. But when he revisited Hill, standing once again above the clouds and taking in the sweeping panorama of mountains, coastline, and open sky, the simplicity of that idea dissolved almost instantly. The land seemed to demand something greater. Perhaps it was the scale of the view, or the echo of childhood memories blended with the ambitions of his adult life. But Hearst could not imagine placing a small structure on such a magnificent stage. The hilltop called for grandeur, for expression, for a statement worthy of the dreams he had carried since his first glimpse of European castles as a boy. And so the bungalow became a blueprint for something larger. That blueprint grew into sketches, sketches became plans, and plans expanded into visions of an estate unlike anything in the country. What began as a weekend retreat suddenly had the potential to become a world unto itself, a place where art, architecture, and landscape could merge into a physical manifestation of Hearst's imagination. San Simeon was no longer just the land of his childhood. It was the canvas on which he would paint the most ambitious creation of his life. Before the first stone of Hearst Castle was ever set, before its towers pierced the sky above San Simeon, William Randolph Hearst needed someone who could translate his imagination into reality. That person was Julia Morgan, an architect of extraordinary discipline, talent, and resolve. Long before she ever met Hearst, Morgan had already broken barriers that seemed immovable at the turn of the century. Born in San Francisco and educated at UC Berkeley, Morgan discovered a passion for architecture early in life. She excelled under the mentorship of Bernard Maybeck, who encouraged her to pursue rigorous training abroad. Her ambition led her to Paris, where she applied to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts. The institution had never before admitted a woman into its architecture program, but Morgan refused to accept that barrier. After repeated attempts and examinations, she finally earned admission, becoming the first woman in the school's history to do so. She completed her training with exceptional skill, mastering classical design principles and structural engineering techniques that would later become hallmarks of her work. When she returned to California, she brought with her not only refined artistic vision, but also formidable engineering expertise. This proved crucial after the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Morgan became instrumental in rebuilding efforts, designing structures that emphasized resilience as much as beauty. Her work on mission-style buildings, women's clubhouses, and educational institutions earned her widespread respect. In 1904, she became the first licensed female architect in California, an achievement that underscored her technical authority in a male-dominated profession. Her connection to the Hearst family began through Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a major patron of educational and cultural projects. Morgan worked on several buildings, funded by Phoebe, establishing a relationship built on respect and trust. Phoebe valued Morgan's clarity, precision, and quiet determination, qualities that later convinced William Randolph Hearst that Morgan was the only architect capable of bringing his San Simeon vision to life. In 1919, shortly after inheriting the ranch, Hearst reached out to Morgan with what initially sounded like a modest request, to design a small bungalow on the hill overlooking the Central Coast. But as Morgan soon discovered, Hearst's ideas rarely remained modest for long. What began as a retreat quickly expanded into a sprawling, layered concept, a Mediterranean-inspired estate infused with European architectural elements, filled with antiquities, and built on a remote hilltop with no existing infrastructure. Morgan did not flinch. She approached the challenge with methodical focus, producing detailed drawings and engineering plans that addressed every angle of the site's demands. Together, Hearst and Morgan formed a partnership remarkable for its creative energy and endurance. Hearst provided the vision, ever-evolving and often extravagant. Morgan translated it into designs that were practical, structurally sound, and breathtaking in their execution. Over the next 3 decades, she would create thousands of drawings and oversee hundreds of structures across the estate: guest houses, terraces, pools, gardens, and the monumental Casa Grande itself. Few architects in history have managed a project of such shifting scale with so much poise. Morgan not only kept up with Hearst, she shaped his sprawling imagination into an architectural legacy that endures to this day. San Simeon became the proving ground for their extraordinary collaboration, a partnership that would build one of the most iconic estates in America. When William Randolph Hearst told Julia Morgan he wanted to build on the hilltop at San Simeon, he offered no hint of the engineering gauntlet it would become. The site, though breathtaking in its beauty, posed staggering logistical challenges. Perched high above the coastline, the hill had no roads, no water lines, no electrical service, nothing resembling the infrastructure required for a project of even modest scale, let alone the one Hearst's imagination would soon demand. Morgan understood immediately that before any structure could rise, the land itself had to be reshaped. Her first task was not designing palatial rooms or sculpted gardens, but orchestrating the construction of access roads that could wind safely up the steep terrain. Crews carved paths through rocky slopes, grading the land to allow trucks and equipment to reach the summit. These were not gentle drives. They were narrow, twisting routes that tested the skill of every driver hauling supplies upward. Next came the essential systems of modern living. Morgan oversaw the development of water pipelines capable of delivering adequate pressure to the hilltop, an achievement requiring careful engineering due to the elevation. She arranged for power lines to extend across the vast ranch, bringing electricity to a place that had been defined for decades by lanterns and campfires. Worker housing sprang up nearby, forming a temporary village to support the hundreds of laborers, artisans, and specialists needed for the undertaking. Only then could construction truly begin. In 1919, Morgan and her teams started on the first buildings, 3 guest houses that would later be known as Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol. Each was designed with the same attention to detail that would eventually define the entire estate. Their creation allowed Hearst and Davies to stay on site as the larger project took shape. With their red-tiled roofs and harmonious blending of Mediterranean and Spanish Revival styles, the guest houses set the tone for the architectural language that would soon dominate the hilltop. Materials for the estate came from all over the world. Hearst imported historic ceilings, marble, tiles, doors, and artworks from Europe, shipping them across the Atlantic and overland to the California coast. Trucks carried stone, lumber, and decorative elements up the mountain roads, often making the journey multiple times a day. The scale of transportation alone was astonishing, thousands of loads enduring the climb to the evolving construction site. But if the logistics were complicated, they were nothing compared to the constant evolution of Hearst's vision. He was endlessly imaginative, frequently asking Morgan to revise plans mid-construction. What began as a bungalow expanded into a trio of guest houses, then into a grand main house, and eventually into a sprawling estate with terraces, pools, gardens, and intricate courtyards. Morgan adapted each time, producing new drawings, adjusting engineering strategies, and coordinating crews to meet the shifting demands. The hilltop that had once held nothing but memories and open sky now buzzed with activity. Stonecutters shaping blocks, carpenters raising beams, electricians stringing cables, and designers refining interior spaces. Morgan managed it all with calm precision, balancing practical reality with Hearst's relentless ambition. By the early years of construction, it was clear. Hearst had not merely started a building project. He had set in motion an ever-expanding dream that would reshape the landscape, challenge his architect, and ultimately define the legacy of San Simeon. At the center of Hearst's growing vision for San Simeon stood Casa Grande, the main house, the crown jewel, and the clearest expression of the grandeur he hoped to achieve. Rising above the hilltop with its twin bell towers and ornate facade, Casa Grande drew inspiration from Spanish Renaissance cathedrals and Mediterranean Revival architecture. It was a building meant not just to impress, but to evoke the centuries of European artistry that had captivated Hearst since childhood. Inside, Casa Grande unfolded like a museum of world treasures. Hearst tirelessly acquired historic ceilings from Spanish monasteries, Flemish tapestries, Italian sculptures, and intricately carved woodwork. Many of these pieces were hundreds of years old, purchased from European estates and shipped across the ocean to be integrated into the castle's design. Julia Morgan worked with extraordinary precision to adapt these antiquities into the building, designing spaces around them so they appeared as though they had always belonged there. The grand rooms reflected this blend of old and new. The assembly room, with its carved wood ceiling, stone fireplace, and towering medieval tapestries, served as the great social hall where guests gathered before dinner. The refectory, modeled after European monasteries, became the formal dining room, long and narrow with a high vaulted ceiling and gleaming banners hanging from the walls. Even the private suites bore the touch of Hearst's collecting instinct, each containing imported furnishings, artwork, and architectural elements that transformed the rooms into miniature galleries. But perhaps no features captured the imagination as powerfully as the estate's pools. The outdoor Neptune pool, originally conceived as a modest swimming area, underwent multiple redesigns as Hearst continued to expand his vision. It eventually became an expansive marble-lined mast, earpiece with colonnades, sculptures, and a Roman temple facade. This constant evolution reflected both Hearst's perfectionism and his desire for the estate to echo the classical beauty he admired during his youth. If Neptune Pool was a monument to the open sky, the Roman pool served as its hidden counterpart, a world of shimmering color and quiet grandeur. Inspired by ancient Roman baths, the indoor facility was adorned with cobalt and gold glass mosaics that glimmered under the water and reflected off the ceiling's intricate designs. Thousands of small tiles, many accented with 24-karat gold, covered every inch of the walls and floors. With black marble diving platforms and floating light reflections, the pool created an atmosphere of surreal elegance. Guests described it as stepping into a jewel box. Throughout the construction of Casa Grande and the pools, Hearst and Morgan worked side by side, refining details and adjusting designs. Hearst would suggest additions or modifications, sometimes mid-construction, and Morgan would translate them into feasible architectural plans. Their collaboration, Hearst's enthusiasm paired with Morgan's meticulous discipline, brought forth an estate that felt both extravagant and artistically coherent. As the rooms filled with antiquities and the structures expanded across the hilltop, San Simeon began to resemble a private museum as much as a residence. The estate became a living chronicle of Hearst's passions: European art, dramatic architecture, and the desire to surround himself with the beauty he had first discovered as a boy abroad. The hilltop was no longer just a childhood memory. It had become a world-class monument to imagination. By the 1920s and 1930s, Hearst Castle had become one of the most sought-after invitations in America. Perched high above the California coast, the estate, its towers glowing in the setting sun, beckoned the era's most famous actors, influential politicians, celebrated writers, and international dignitaries. For Hollywood stars especially, San Simeon was a glamorous escape, a world above the world, where the stresses of studios and contracts melted into nights of conversation, music, and spectacle. Guests arriving at the ranch followed a ritual that reflected both Hearst's hospitality and his need for order. They were driven up the long, winding road to the hilltop, where the castle appeared like a mirage emerging from the fog. Upon stepping out of the car, they were greeted warmly, often by Marion Davies herself. Davies, with her natural charm and radiant humor, made newcomers feel instantly at ease. She remembered names, introduced people with care, and infused each gathering with the lightheartedness Hearst valued so deeply. Daily life at San Simeon revolved around a structured routine, one designed entirely by Hearst. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner occurred at fixed times, regardless of who was visiting. Alcohol was allowed, but moderated, a reflection of Hearst's preference for order over excess. While the estate was famous for its beauty and celebrated company, it was not the setting of wild, unruly parties. Rather, it functioned like a refined social retreat where relaxation happened on Hearst's terms. Entertainment, however, was abundant. Guests swam in the Neptune pool, lounged on sun-drenched terraces, or explored the grand rooms filled with art from across the world. In the evenings, Hearst hosted film screenings in his private theater, often showcasing the latest releases, especially those featuring Marion Davies. Many visitors, including Charlie Chaplin and Clarence K. Gable, gathered after screenings in the assembly room, participating in long discussions or casual games of cards. For Hearst, these moments were as much about enjoyment as they were about cultivating influence. The guest list itself read like a who's who of the era. Figures such as Winston Churchill, Bernard Shaw, and various statesmen found themselves mingling with Hollywood royalty. The atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. World leaders and movie stars shared meals, swapped stories, and enjoyed Davies' quick wit. The cross-section of politics, entertainment, and journalism reflected a world in which Hearst's influence reached far beyond his newspapers. His hospitality shaped conversations, alliances, and cultural currents in ways subtle and overt. Adding to the estate's fascination was the private zoo, one of the largest in the world at the time. Zebras roamed the hillsides, mingling with cattle from the ranch. Lions, bears, camels, and exotic birds lived in enclosures scattered across the property. The presence of such animals astonished visitors. For many, it was their first glimpse of creatures usually found only in distant exhibits or foreign lands. The zoo became another symbol of Hearst's expansive imagination and capacity for extravagance. San Simeon's reputation grew rapidly. Newspapers and magazines wrote about its shimmering pools, its towering house, its endless treasures, and its legendary gatherings. Although access was by invitation only, stories of San Simeon drifted far beyond California, establishing the estate as a cultural landmark, a place where Hollywood dreams and political ambitions shared the same dinner table. Hearst Castle had become more than a home. It was a stage where power mingled with celebrity, shaped by the man who built it and the woman who filled it with joy. And for a time, no place in America felt more alive. For all its brilliance and beauty, San Simeon carried a hidden weight, one that grew heavier as the 1920s progressed. Hearst's vision for the estate was vast, intricate, and ever-evolving, but it was also enormously expensive. Construction crews worked year-round. Art shipments arrived from Europe by the crate. Architectural changes were made mid-project, each requiring new materials, new labor, and new plans from Julia Morgan. What had begun as a retreat escalated into a decades-long architectural endeavor, and the costs rose just as rapidly. At first, Hearst's vast media empire absorbed these expenses with ease. His newspapers flourished, his magazines expanded, and his holdings diversified across film and radio. But beneath the surface, the balance between income and expenditure began to tilt in the wrong direction. Hearst's appetite for acquisition, artwork, building materials, land, and businesses exceeded even his considerable revenue. He poured money not only into San Simeon, but into political campaigns, film ventures, and aggressive newspaper expansion. The spending seemed sustainable until the world around him changed. The Great Depression hit the United States with devastating force in 1929, and Hearst's empire felt the shock immediately. Advertising revenue plummeted. Circulation fell as families tightened budgets. Operational costs for his far-reaching media network remained high, and the cash flow that had once seemed endless began to thin. Hearst had always believed he could outpace financial challenges through sheer energy and ambition, but the economic downturn was larger than any individual effort. By the mid-1930s, the reality became impossible to ignore. Hearst was carrying massive debts. His financial obligations, compounded by years of unchecked spending, threatened to unravel his empire. Banks and creditors stepped in, forcing him to liquidate portions of his extensive art collection and relinquish direct control over many of his operations. The banking consortium that assumed authority over his finances worked to stabilize the situation, but it came at a personal cost to Hearst. A man accustomed to directing every detail suddenly found himself constrained, his decisions subject to approval from others. Construction at San Simeon reflected this shift. Where once crews filled the hilltop with constant activity, stonecutters shaping blocks, carpenters erecting beams, decorators refining interiors, the pace slowed significantly. Julia Morgan continued to oversee the project, but resources were limited, and many of Hearst's more ambitious additions were postponed or quietly abandoned. The estate, once a symbol of boundless growth, entered a quieter phase. Public perception of Hearst evolved as well. His newspapers, previously pillars of influence, faced criticism for their sensational style and political entanglements. Rivals seized on his financial troubles, and the myth of the invincible media baron began to crack. Though he retained loyal supporters, the aura of absolute dominance that had surrounded him for decades weakened. Through it all, Hearst struggled to preserve San Simeon, a place that had come to represent not only his achievements, but also the emotional core of his life with Marion Davies. Yet the pressures of debt, public scrutiny, and diminishing control weighed heavily on him. The hilltop remained magnificent, but beneath the grandeur lay a truth Hearst could no longer outrun. Even the greatest dreams must contend with the limits of fortune and time. By the 1940s, the intensity that had once driven William Randolph Hearst was dimming. Decades of relentless work, unbroken ambition, and the emotional toll of financial struggles had left their mark. His health began a steady decline, and the hilltop at San Simeon, once filled with bustling crews and glamorous gatherings, grew quieter. Friends still visited, and Marion Davies remained a constant, comforting presence, but the energy of earlier years had faded. Even Hearst, who had built his life on momentum, could no longer ignore the limits of age. Though he knew he needed better medical care, the idea of leaving San Simeon weighed heavily on him. The estate had become more than a home. It was his greatest creation, a place where his childhood dreams and adult ambitions intertwined. He wandered its rooms with increased nostalgia, pausing before carved ceilings he had acquired from European monasteries, studying paintings he had personally chosen, and standing on terraces that looked out over the same coastline he had admired as a boy. Every stone felt familiar. Every corridor carried memories. Leaving meant accepting that the chapter was closing, and Hearst resisted that truth with a quiet, aching reluctance. But by 1947, the decision was unavoidable. His doctors insisted that he needed constant, specialized care, and that the remoteness of San Simeon posed serious risks. Beverly Hills, with its proximity to hospitals and medical staff, offered what the hilltop could not. Marion Davies, who had long cared for him with unwavering devotion, encouraged him gently, knowing the move was necessary for his safety. With deep reluctance, Hearst agreed. When the day of departure arrived, he took one last slow walk through Casa Grande. The once lively rooms echoed softly around him, their opulence muted by the weight of the moment. He stepped outside and looked over the estate, the pools, the gardens, the guest houses, the sweeping views that had captivated him for so many years. It was a farewell he did not speak aloud, but felt profoundly. Hearst was taken to Beverly Hills, where he settled into a quieter life. His final years were markedly subdued. He no longer commanded the vast media empire with the same force. Much of the day-to-day operations had been delegated to his sons and corporate officers. Marion remained by his side, providing companionship and care, shielding him from unnecessary stress, and offering comfort as his health declined. Their bond, forged decades earlier, endured with the same loyalty that had defined their life together. On August 14, 1951, William Randolph Hearst passed away at the age of 88. News of his death spread quickly, appearing in the very newspapers he had once directed with such authority. Tributes acknowledged his influence as a media pioneer, while reflections on his life noted both his achievements and controversies. But for those who knew him personally, especially Marion Davies, the loss was deeply personal. She mourned not the magnate the public knew, but the companion with whom she had shared more than 30 years of her life. Though Hearst never returned to San Simeon after his departure, the hilltop remained inseparable from his legacy. His dream, carved into stone and crowned by towers overlooking the sea, endured long after he was gone, an enduring reminder of the man who built a world on a mountaintop. After William Randolph Hearst's death in 1951, San Simeon entered a period of quietness it had not known since construction began more than 3 decades earlier. The once bustling hilltop, with its workers, celebrities, politicians, and constant flow of activity, now stood still. The grand terraces lay empty, the pools glimmered in silence, and the ornate rooms held only echoes of the conversations and laughter that had once filled them. For a time, the castle remained in the hands of the Hearst family, cared for but unused, its future uncertain. That changed in 1957 when the Hearst family made a pivotal decision. Recognizing the estate's historical and cultural significance, and understanding that its maintenance was beyond what any private household could reasonably sustain, they gifted the castle and a portion of the surrounding land to the state of California. With this extraordinary act, the private world William Randolph Hearst had built was transformed into a public treasure. Later that year, the property opened to visitors as the Hearst San Simeon State Historical Monument. What had once been an exclusive retreat for a select few now welcomed people from around the world. The public, for the first time, could walk through Casa Grande, marvel at its imported ceilings, admire its vast art collection, and stand beside the Neptune and Roman pools. The estate's preservation became a priority for the state, which undertook efforts to maintain the structure's integrity while ensuring that Hearst's original vision remained intact. Guided tours were developed to help visitors understand the intricate blend of architecture, artistry, and history that defined the site. Julia Morgan's presence lingered in every stone and archway, though for many years her role in creating the estate was not widely acknowledged beyond architectural circles. She had passed away in 1957, the Salsam, a year the castle opened to the public without having seen the full recognition her work would eventually receive. Over time, however, appreciation for her contributions grew. Scholars and historians began to highlight her extraordinary career, her pioneering achievements, and the technical brilliance required to bring Hearst's shifting ideas to life. In 2014, she was posthumously awarded the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, the first woman ever to receive the honor, cementing her legacy as one of the most influential architects in American history. Today, Hearst Castle is one of California's most visited historic sites, drawing over 1 million visitors in some years. People come not only to admire its opulence, but also to understand the story behind it, a story of imagination, ambition, collaboration, and resilience. They walk through the refectory where international guests once dined, gaze into the depths of the Roman pool where light shimmers against gold mosaics, and stand on the terraces overlooking the vast landscape that first inspired Hearst as a boy. The castle remains a monument not simply to wealth, but to a dream carved into the hillside. Hearst's life, with all its triumphs and contradictions, left behind a structure that transcended the man himself. And thanks to Julia Morgan's genius and the preservation efforts that followed, the estate continues to endure, solid, breathtaking, and timeless. High above the coast, in the place where fog meets sky, Hearst's dream still stands,